When the workmen tore out the staircase in the boarding house on Hawthorne Street, they were expecting rotten wood and maybe a rat's nest. They were not expecting a human skull to roll out from the dark space beneath the steps and land at their feet. The newspapers would later call her the woman buried in the boarding house, as if she had never had a real name, a real life, or a reason for climbing those stairs in the first place. Before she became a headline and a set of bones, she was just a widow, carrying a scuffed trunk, looking for a room that locked. Her name was Eleanor Hart. In 1910, being a 32-year-old widow in a small town meant that every choice you made was someone else's business. Eleanor had tried to live with it after her husband died of pneumonia the previous winter. She wore the black dress, sat through the well-meaning church visits, and accepted casseroles she did not want. She listened as people told her what she should do next: move in with her sister, remarry, find some kind of work that is appropriate for a lady in your situation. They meant well. She could not breathe, so she did something most of them would have called reckless. She sold what little furniture she had, paid off as many of her husband's debts as she could, packed 2 dresses, a coat, and a few keepsakes into a trunk, and bought a train ticket to a city where no one knew who poor Ellie Hart was. The city did not welcome her. It did not notice her at all. When she stepped off the train into the smoke and noise, Eleanor was just another woman in a dark dress, with tired eyes, and a trunk that looked too heavy for her. The station swarmed with people going somewhere urgent, men in suits, women with children pulling at their hands, porters shouting. No one looked at her long enough to care where she would sleep that night. She found the boarding house on Hawthorne Street by following a small ad in the newspaper. Respectable rooms for ladies, weekly rates, no drinking, no men brought upstairs. It sounded strict, but strict was better than dangerous. From the outside, the house looked almost delicate. 3 stories of narrow brick, lace curtains in the front windows, 2 potted ferns on the stoop that somehow stayed alive despite the coal smoke. A brass plate by the door read, "Rooms to let." The letters were polished so often they caught the weak winter light like a mirror. Eleanor stood at the bottom of the steps, with one hand on the trunk handle and one hand on the rail. Her legs ached from the journey. Her savings were folded in an envelope inside her coat. If this house refused her, she had no backup plan. She made herself climb. Before she could knock, the door opened. "Can I help you, dear?" The woman in the doorway was short and square-shouldered, with gray hair pinned into a practical bun, and a black dress that had been mended carefully along the seams. She wore a small cross at her throat and a look that was almost kind but not quite soft. "I was told you let rooms," Eleanor said, "for women who work." "We do," the woman answered. "Weekly rates in advance. No liquor, no gentlemen callers. Breakfast at 7, supper at 6, and you keep your door locked after 9. I am Mrs. Whitcomb. You may call me Mrs. W." The rules came out so quickly, they sounded practiced, like a prayer she had said 100 times. To Eleanor, who had spent months being treated like a piece of glass, the firmness was almost comforting. "I can pay," Eleanor said, fingers tightening on the envelope in her pocket. "I do not drink. I will be looking for work in a shop or an office." Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes flicked over her. The plain dress, the worn shoes, the wedding band, she still had not found the courage to remove. "A widow?" "Yes." Mrs. Whitcomb nodded once, as if that explained everything. "Come in, Mrs. Hart. We will see what we can do." The entry hall smelled of soap, boiled cabbage, and coal smoke. Framed prints of peaceful countryside scenes hung on the walls, cows by a stream, a girl in a field of flowers, a church with its doors open to the sky. The staircase rose straight ahead, carpeted in red that had faded toward brown. Each stair had a shallow dip in the middle where decades of feet had worn it down. If Eleanor had stopped to look closely, she might have noticed that one step near the bottom creaked twice when you stepped on it, as if something underneath shifted a fraction of a second after your weight passed. But she did not. She was too busy trying not to shake. In the small parlor, Mrs. Whitcomb asked the questions a landlady was supposed to ask. Where Eleanor was from, whether she had family in the city, what kind of work she was seeking. Eleanor told the edited truth. She could sew, keep accounts, and type a little. She had a sister in another state, but did not want to be a burden. She needed a room of her own, at least for a while. Mrs. Whitcomb listened with that same almost kind, almost cold expression. "You will find work," she said finally. "This city always finds use for a woman who is not afraid of work. As long as you follow the house rules and pay on time, you will have no trouble from me." She named a price. It made Eleanor's stomach tighten, but it was fair. Cheaper than a hotel. Safer than the boarding houses near the station, with their loud music and men leaning in doorways. "You may have room 3, Mrs. Whitcomb said. "Second floor, front. It gets the morning light. The last lady who had it left." Suddenly, she did not give notice. The way she said it, flat, dismissive, made something prickle at the back of Eleanor's neck. "Did she leave her things?" Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. "A few odds and ends," Mrs. Whitcomb said. "Nothing of value. People who run from their obligations rarely take time to pack properly." She did not elaborate. Eleanor told herself it was none of her business. The staircase was narrower than it had looked from the hall. As they climbed, the air grew warmer, the smell of cooking stronger. Doors lined the corridor upstairs, each with a small brass number and a keyhole, shiny from use. From behind one came a cough. From another, a low male voice, quickly shushed when their footsteps passed. "Mostly respectable people," Mrs. Whitcomb said, without being asked. "A clerk, a school teacher, a nurse who works nights. I do not tolerate foolishness. If you hear anything that worries you, you tell me, not the police. We keep our problems in the house." The sentence was casual, but the meaning lodged in Eleanor's mind. She pushed it aside. Room 3 was small but neat. A narrow iron bed, a washstand, a wardrobe that smelled faintly of camphor, a single chair, and a window that looked out over Hawthorne Street. Someone had laid a quilt across the bed with tiny, perfect stitches that must have taken months. Eleanor set her handbag on the chair and touched the quilt with the tips of her fingers. "This will do," she said. Downstairs, she signed her name in the ledger. The book was thick, its pages filled with the names of people who had come and gone long before her. Some entries had been crossed out. A few lines had no forwarding address, just a date of arrival, and a blank space where "new residence" should have been. Mrs. Whitcomb closed the ledger quickly, as if she did not like anyone reading it too closely. That first night, Eleanor lay awake longer than she meant to. The house had a different soundscape than the farm or the little town she had left. Pipes thumped in the walls. The clock in the hallway chimed the quarter hour with a slightly sour note. Someone upstairs paced for a while and then stopped. Just as she began to drift toward sleep, there was a noise that did not fit. A heavy, dragging sound somewhere below her room, like a piece of furniture being pulled slowly across a rough floor. It stopped. Then there was a dull thud, muffled by distance, and the faint scrape of metal on wood. Eleanor held her breath and listened. Silence. Then, after a few seconds, the familiar creak of Mrs. Whitcomb's footsteps on the stairs as she made her rounds, checking doors, turning down gas, making sure everything in her house was exactly where it should be. Eleanor told herself it was nothing. A coal scuttle, a loose board. A house like this had to have noises of its own. She did not know that years later, men with crowbars would be standing on those same steps, listening to the same strange double creak and wondering what on earth was buried under there. By the end of her first week on Hawthorne Street, Eleanor Hart knew the boarding house well enough to navigate it in the dark. She knew which stair creaked twice, which window stuck in damp weather, and exactly how many steps it took to get from her room to the front door, without brushing against anyone. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that one part of the house had already been reserved for her, long before she ever arrived. Mornings began with the bell. At 7 o'clock sharp, a small brass bell on the kitchen wall rang twice. The sound traveled up the staircase like a command. Doors opened. Feet shuffled. Voices cleared sleep from their throats. By the time Eleanor reached the dining room on the ground floor, the long table was already half full. "Good morning, Mrs. Hart," said Miss Parker, the school teacher, adjusting her spectacles as if she had been up for hours. "Sleep well?" "Well enough," Eleanor lied. In truth, she had woken twice in the night. Once at the strange, dragging sound below the stairs. Once at the soft click of a door closing somewhere down the hall. Both times she had stared at the ceiling until her heartbeat slowed. At the head of the table, Mrs. Whitcomb ladled porridge into bowls with the efficient movements of someone who had been doing the same thing every day for 20 years. She wore the same black dress, the same small cross. Her eyes skimmed the table, taking attendance, without needing to count. "Mr. Davies, do not forget your hat," she said, without looking at him. "You left it in the hall twice last week." "Yes, Mrs. W." The balding clerk gave a nervous chuckle. "Ruth, you work this evening?" "Late shift," the telephone girl murmured. "Then sleep when you can. You look worn to a thread." Her tone was brisk, but there was an odd pride in the way she spoke to them, as if the tenants were pieces on a board she had arranged just so. Eleanor watched her. In other boarding houses she had heard, landladies were either indifferent or intrusive. Mrs. Whitcomb was both, depending on where you sat. She never asked questions that sounded personal. Yet within 3 days of Eleanor's arrival, she knew how much money Eleanor had left, which shops she had applied to, and which streets she walked home on. "You are not to cut through the alley behind the theater," Mrs. Whitcomb said one evening as Eleanor shrugged on her coat. "Too many men loiter there after dark. Take the main street, even if it is longer." "How did you—" Eleanor started. She had not mentioned the shortcut to anyone. "I know this city better than you do," Mrs. Whitcomb said. "If you are under my roof, you will behave as if you had someone looking out for you, even if you think you do not." It sounded like concern. It felt like surveillance. Life in the house settled into a pattern. Mornings, breakfast and job hunting. Afternoons, sewing small repairs for other tenants for a few cents, or sitting in the parlor writing letters to employers who might need a bookkeeper. Evenings, shared meals and quiet conversations in the parlor, the radio hissing out news and songs. Eleanor began to learn the stories of the people around her. Mr. Davies, the clerk, had once dreamed of being a lawyer, but never had the money for school. He spoke often about figures and ledgers, never about family. Miss Parker graded papers in the parlor with ruthless red ink, complaining about her pupils' spelling mistakes. Ruth, from the telephone exchange, measured her days in calls and wrong numbers, returning home with a headache and a permanent dent in her left ear from the receiver. There were men, too, though fewer. A traveling salesman who stayed for 2 weeks at a time and always paid in cash. A night watchman who slept during the day and moved like a ghost through the house after dark. According to Mrs. Whitcomb, they were all perfectly respectable, a phrase she used often enough that it began to sound like a warning. For a house like this to survive, she said once, it must be beyond reproach. People are quick to talk. One scandal, and the decent lodgers vanish. Eleanor believed her. She had already seen what gossip could do in a small town. Still, the house had its oddities. One afternoon, returning early from a disappointing interview at a draper's shop, Eleanor stepped through the front door and froze. The entry hall, usually smelling of soap and cabbage, reeked of something sharper. A sour, metallic tang that made the back of her throat itch. Mrs. Whitcomb stood at the bottom of the stairs with a bucket and a scrub brush. The boards beneath her were wet. The smell was strongest there. "Mind your step, Mrs. Hart," she said calmly. "A pipe in the kitchen burst. Nasty water. I'm scrubbing it out before it stains." The explanation did not fit the smell, but Eleanor did not argue. She stepped carefully around the damp patch and went up to her room. Later, when she came down for supper, the boards were dry, and the odor was gone, masked by the heavy scent of stew. Another time she overheard fragments of a conversation as she passed the parlor. "I have written to her brother twice," Mrs. Whitcomb was saying in a low voice. "If she chooses not to answer, that is hardly my fault. She left her rent unpaid and her room in shameful condition. What was I supposed to do? Keep it empty forever?" "Still," a man's voice replied, "people say she would not have left without her trunk." "The trunk was old and half-rotted," Mrs. Whitcomb snapped. "I did her a favor by disposing of it. Some people cannot accept that not everyone wants to be found." Eleanor slowed, then forced herself to keep walking. It was none of her business. Yet the words lodged in her mind like splinters. A woman who left without her trunk. A trunk disposed of. That evening, alone in room 3, Eleanor looked at her own trunk in the corner. It held everything that tied her to her past. Letters, the marriage certificate she had not shown to anyone here, a photograph of her parents, a lock of her husband's hair wrapped in paper. The idea of someone throwing it away without asking made her chest tighten. She thought of asking Mrs. Whitcomb directly about the woman who had been in the room before her. But there was something in the older woman's eyes that did not invite questions, only obedience. Instead, Eleanor asked Ruth. They sat together in the small bedroom Ruth rented at the back of the house, drinking weak tea from chipped cups. "Did you know the woman who had my room before?" Eleanor asked. Mrs. W. said she left suddenly. Ruth hesitated, twisting the cup in her hands. I did not know her well, she said. She kept to herself. Quiet. Like you. She worked at the laundry down on King Street. One day she was just gone. Gone how? Mrs. W. told us she ran off with some man, that she left owing rent. Ruth shrugged, but her eyes were uneasy. I never heard her talk about a man, but people leave all the time. Maybe she did not owe us an explanation. Did she take her things? Mrs. W. said she did, Ruth answered. But I remember seeing a black dress still hanging on the door hook when she showed the room to the next person. Maybe she just forgot it. Eleanor did not push further. There was a rule in houses like this. You did not dig too deeply into other people's disappearances. Everyone had something they were running from. Everyone wanted to believe they could leave if they had to. Days blurred into weeks. Eleanor finally found work at a milliner's shop, sewing ribbons and trimming hats until her fingers ached. The pay was small but steady. Each Saturday she counted out her rent in neat coins at the kitchen table, while Mrs. Whitcomb added the number to the ledger with a satisfied scratch of her pen. "You are one of the reliable ones," Mrs. Whitcomb said. "Not everyone is." She said it like a compliment. Eleanor heard the implication. People who stopped paying ceased to be real lodgers. They became problems to be handled. Despite the odd moments, there were times when the house almost felt like a home. On Sunday evenings, when most of the tenants were in, Mrs. Whitcomb would serve a slightly better supper. Roast chicken instead of stew, perhaps a pie if she was in a good mood. The radio would play a hymn, and for an hour the room would be full of soft conversation and the illusion of family. One such evening, as rain tapped against the windows and the street outside blurred into streaks under the gas lamps, Eleanor looked around the table and thought, almost with relief, I am safe here. She did not see the way Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes lingered on her a fraction of a second longer than on the others, as if measuring something. Later that night, as Eleanor climbed the stairs to room 3, the double creak sounded under her feet again. This time she paused, one hand on the banister, and pressed her weight down, testing. The wood gave a little, then settled. Beneath that step, in the narrow, dusty void between the underside of the staircase and the packed earth floor, there was enough space for a trunk. Enough space for something else, too. Eleanor could not see into that darkness. She only heard the echo of the creak and felt a small, irrational chill run up her spine. She shook it off, unlocked her door, and went inside. For now, the house kept its secrets. By the time autumn settled over the city, Eleanor Hart's life had shrunk to a narrow triangle: the milliner's shop, the streets in between, and the boarding house on Hawthorne Street. From the outside, nothing about that triangle looked dangerous. Inside it, pressure was building in ways she could not see. At the shop, things were getting worse. When she had first been hired, the owner, Mrs. Langley, had praised Eleanor's steady hands and careful stitches. "You have a good eye," she had said. "If you keep at it, you might one day design pieces instead of just trimming them." For a while, that promise had kept Eleanor moving through 12-hour days of feathers, ribbons, and sore fingers. But as the months went on, orders slowed. A new department store downtown began selling ready-made hats cheaper than any small shop could manage. Customers drifted away. Mrs. Langley's smile became tight. She started sending girls home early, unpaid, when business was slow. One evening, after locking the door, She called Eleanor into the back room. "You are my best hand," she said, not looking at her. "But the numbers are not good. I can keep you on 3 days a week. No more. If things improve, I will call you in. If not—" She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. 3 days' pay would barely cover rent and food. Eleanor walked back to Hawthorne Street with a knot in her stomach, each step counting out coins she did not have. Rain had started to fall, turning the gas lamps into smeared halos. By the time she reached the boarding house, her coat was damp, and her hair stuck to her forehead. Mrs. Whitcomb was waiting in the hall. "You are late," she said. It was only 15 minutes past Eleanor's usual time, but in this house routines were fixed enough that any variation stood out. "I had to speak with my employer," Eleanor said, hanging up her coat. "She is cutting back my hours." Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes flicked down to the hem of Eleanor's dress, wet and slightly muddy. "Money troubles?" "Fewer customers," Eleanor admitted. "I will manage." Mrs. Whitcomb did not answer immediately. She tapped her fingers once on the banister, a small, thoughtful movement. "You are a sensible woman, Mrs. Hart," she said at last. "You know how important it is to keep up with rent. I run a house for respectable people. I cannot allow arrears. It leads to all kinds of—" She paused, searching for a word. "Complications." "I understand," Eleanor said quickly. "I will not fall behind." She meant it. She believed it. But meaning and believing do not change numbers on a page. Over the next few weeks, she stretched every coin. She skipped lunch on the days she worked. She watered down soup on the days she did not. When a button came off her only other dress, she reattached it with tiny, invisible stitches, and told herself she did not need anything new. The envelope of savings in her trunk grew thinner. At the same time, the house was tightening around her. The smell in the hallway came back twice, sharp, metallic, wrong. Each time, Mrs. Whitcomb had an explanation ready. "Spoiled meat from the butcher's," she would say. "A dead rat in the wall. I have taken care of it." The boards would be scrubbed, the smell covered with stronger odors. Bleach, lye, a pot of onions boiling on the stove. One afternoon, Eleanor came home early and found the front door unlocked, the hall empty. She called out a greeting. No answer. The house felt different, hollow, as if it were holding its breath. As she started up the stairs, she heard voices below, not in the kitchen, but under the stairs. "Heavy as sin," a man muttered. "You want the whole neighborhood to hear you?" "Just lift," Mrs. Whitcomb hissed. "You are being paid well enough." There was a scraping sound. Something solid, dragged over earth. Eleanor froze on the middle step. If she leaned over the banister, she knew she could see down into the cramped cellar, through the half-open door beneath the staircase. But leaning would mean making a sound. She stayed where she was, heart pounding, and listened. "We could just take it out back," the man said. "Less bother." "And have the neighbors see?" Mrs. Whitcomb snapped. "Use your head. This way, nobody asks questions. Nobody sees anything. When it is done, they will forget she was ever here, just like they always do." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the railing until her knuckles hurt. They. She. The words marched through her mind. She told herself she was misunderstanding, that they were talking about furniture, about rubbish, about anything but what her imagination insisted on. The scraping stopped. The cellar door slammed. Footsteps moved away. Only then did Eleanor climb the rest of the stairs, as quietly as she could, and slip into her room. That night she wrote a letter to her younger sister, Anna, for the first time in months. "I am well enough," she wrote, which was not entirely true. "I have found work, though there is less of it now. The lady who runs the house is strict, but the roof does not leak and the food is hot. Sometimes I think about coming to you, but I do not want to be a burden." Her pen hovered, then scratched out a new line. "If anything ever happens to me, please know that I tried to make my own way." She stared at the sentence, then crossed it out until the ink tore the paper. She could not send Anna a letter full of half-formed fears. She folded a cleaner version instead, left out the strange smells and stranger noises, and mailed it the next morning. As money grew tighter, Mrs. Whitcomb's attention sharpened. At the Saturday rent collection, Eleanor came to the kitchen with coins counted to the last cent. Mrs. Whitcomb laid them out on the table and added them with the tip of her pencil, lips moving silently. "You are short $2, she said. Eleanor felt heat flood her face. "Mrs. W., Mrs. Langley cut my days again. I will have it next week, I promise. I can take in extra sewing." Mrs. Whitcomb held up a hand. "Rent is due when rent is due," she said. "If I make exceptions for one, I must make them for all. That is not how a proper house is run." "I know," Eleanor whispered. "Please, just this once." For a moment, something like calculation flickered across Mrs. Whitcomb's face. Then her expression softened by a degree. "You are not one of the hopeless cases," she said. "I do not like to see a woman of sense thrown back into the street because of a bad month." She reached into the ledger and, with a neat stroke, placed a small mark next to Eleanor's name. "We will call it a note of credit," she said. "You will repay it, with interest. And in return, you will help me with some extra tasks around the house. There is always laundry, mending, small jobs. This way, you earn your keep." Relief crashed over Eleanor so strongly that she almost did not hear the last sentence. "Thank you," she said. "I will do whatever is needed." Mrs. Whitcomb smiled, the kind of smile people give when a piece has moved exactly where they wanted it on the board. "I knew you would be reasonable," she said. The extra tasks turned out to be more than laundry. Eleanor found herself scrubbing floors late into the night, polishing brass, carrying heavy coal scuttles from the yard. Once Mrs. Whitcomb asked her to help move an old trunk from the attic to the cellar. It was heavier than it looked, the leather cracked and darkened with age. The handles dug into Eleanor's palms. "Whose was this?" Eleanor asked, more to distract herself from the weight than out of real curiosity. "Does it matter?" Mrs. Whitcomb said. "People leave things behind. I make sure the house does not become a junkyard." "Down the stairs now. Careful on that step." They maneuvered the trunk level with the creaking stair. For a second, Eleanor felt it tilt toward the gap beneath, as if the house itself were trying to swallow it. She yanked it back, heart racing. "In there," Mrs. Whitcomb said, nodding toward the cellar. "Against the far wall." The cellar was small and low, the air damp and cold. The floor was packed earth, uneven and discolored. In the weak light of the single bulb, Eleanor thought she saw a patch near the bottom of the stairs that looked fresher, as if it had been dug and refilled recently. She opened her mouth to ask, then saw Mrs. Whitcomb watching her. "Do not dawdle," the landlady said. Eleanor lowered the trunk, wiped her hands on her skirt, and followed her back upstairs. From the outside, nothing seemed different. To the other lodgers, Eleanor was still the quiet widow in room 3, polite, punctual, grateful. But inside, a slow dread was unspooling. She had no money left in her trunk. She owed rent to a woman who kept her ledger like a judge keeps a docket. She had heard voices under the stairs talking about making someone disappear. And every night, when she climbed to her room, the double creak of that one step reminded her that there was something under this house that did not belong there. On a cold evening, near the end of November, she made a decision she should have made months earlier. She would leave. She would write to Anna again, this time asking plainly if she could come, just for a while. She would pawn her wedding ring, if she had to, use the money for a ticket, and walk out of Hawthorne Street before the house finished closing its grip. She did not know that for some people in that house, her leaving was not part of the plan at all. The night Eleanor Hart finally tried to leave the boarding house was not stormy or dramatic or different in any obvious way. That is what makes it so unsettling. From the outside, it looked like any other Thursday on Hawthorne Street. Inside, in room 3, a woman was quietly trying to slip out of a life that had already decided it was not finished with her. She waited until the house was almost asleep. Downstairs, supper had been the usual stew. Mrs. Whitcomb had been in a brisk mood, talking about rising prices and the ungratefulness of some lodgers who did not appreciate a respectable roof over their heads. Eleanor had kept her head down, answering when spoken to, agreeing where agreement was expected. In her pocket, folded into a small square, was a letter she had written to her sister Anna. "I should have written sooner," the letter began. "Things here are not what I hoped. Work has become unreliable. The woman who runs the house is difficult. I am not in danger yet, but I am afraid if I stay much longer, I will be. If there is any way I might come to you for a time, I would be grateful. I can work. I will not be a burden for long." She had hesitated over the phrase, "not in danger yet." It felt like telling a lie and a truth at the same time. In the end, she left it, because it was the closest she could get to putting her fear into words without sounding hysterical. Her plan was simple. In the morning, she would post the letter and ask Mrs. Langley at the shop for an advance, just enough for a cheap ticket. If Anna's reply took too long, she would pawn her wedding ring. It was all she had left that would bring any money. But that night, as she sat on the bed counting and recounting the few coins in her purse, there was a knock on her door. Not a tentative tap. 3 firm raps, evenly spaced. Eleanor swallowed and smoothed her skirt. "Come in." The door opened without a key turning. Mrs. Whitcomb stepped inside. "You forgot to lock," she said, as if that was the only problem with the scene. Her eyes took in the open trunk at the foot of the bed, the folded dresses, the small stack of letters, the purse on the mattress. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Hart?" Eleanor's mouth went dry. She had not told anyone she was planning to leave. But in this house, secrets did not stay secret for long. "I was putting things in order," she said. "It is wise to be ready. Winter is coming." Mrs. Whitcomb closed the door behind her, gently. "This house," she said, "has seen many winters. It has also seen many boarders who think they can come and go as they please, leaving debts and problems behind them. I am sure you are not one of those, are you?" "No," Eleanor said quickly. "I intend to pay what I owe." "Intend," Mrs. Whitcomb repeated softly, as if tasting the word and finding it insufficient. Intention does not keep coal in the scuttle. She stepped farther into the room, eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "I have been patient with you," she said. "More patient than I am with most? I gave you credit? I gave you work when your employer cut your hours? I kept a clean, safe roof over your head. You are not a fool, Mrs. Hart. You know how rare that is for a woman in your situation." "I am grateful," Eleanor said. Her voice sounded small, even to her own ears. "And yet," Mrs. Whitcomb continued, "here you are, packing as if you mean to walk out in the middle of the night without so much as a proper conversation about our arrangement." "I would not do that," Eleanor protested. "I was going to speak with you in the morning. I am only considering my options." Mrs. Whitcomb's smile was thin. "Your options," she said, "are not as many as you think." She moved to the window, drew back the curtain an inch, and looked out into the street. Gas lamps cast pale circles on the wet cobblestones. The city hummed faintly, distant and uncaring. "Do you know what happens to women who leave places like this without a plan?" she asked. "I have seen it. They end up in rooms where there are no rules at all, where men come and go at all hours, where no one knows their name until it appears in the newspaper under the word unidentified. Is that what you want?" "No," Eleanor whispered. "Then be sensible." Mrs. Whitcomb let the curtain fall back into place and turned. There was something new in her expression now, something almost gentle, layered over the steel. "You are tired," she said. "You are frightened. You have been through more than most. Widowhood, money trouble, uncertainty. It is no wonder you start imagining that the walls are closing in on you. But this house is not your enemy, Mrs. Hart. The world outside is." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "If you stay, I can help you. I can speak to a friend who runs a bakery 2 streets over. He needs someone reliable to help with accounts. It would be better than that hat shop. Steadier. I could adjust your rent for a month. Make things easier while you settle." It was an appealing picture, delivered in a tone that almost sounded like kindness. For one dizzy second, Eleanor wanted to believe it completely, to pretend that the double creaking stair, the smells, the voices under the floor, had all been products of her own anxiety. But then she remembered the words she had overheard in the cellar. "This way, nobody asks questions. When it is done, they will forget she was ever here, just like they always do." There was a trap somewhere in the offer. She could feel it. "I appreciate that," she said carefully. "Truly. But I have family I have neglected. It would be wrong of me not to see them, at least for a time. If I can go to my sister and get my feet under me there, I will be less of a burden anywhere I live." For the first time, something hard and unmasked flickered in Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes. "Family," she said, the word edged with contempt. "Where were they when your husband died? Where were they when you came here with nothing but a trunk and a look like the world had ended?" Eleanor flinched. "They have their own struggles," she said. "I do not blame them, but I must at least ask." Mrs. Whitcomb took one step closer. They were almost the same height, but in that moment the older woman seemed to fill the room. "Write your letter, if it eases your conscience," she said quietly. "But understand this. Until you have somewhere else to go and the money to get there, this house is where you belong. You have obligations here, to me, to the roof over your head, to the bed you sleep in. People do not simply walk away from that. Not in my house." Something about the way she said "my house" made the hair on Eleanor's arms stand up. "I will not leave without settling things," Eleanor said. "I promise you that." Mrs. Whitcomb studied her for a long moment. Then, just as quickly as the tension had risen, she seemed to release it. "Very well," she said. "We shall talk again in a few days. For now you should rest. You look worn out. Tired minds make foolish decisions." She moved to the door, hand on the knob. "Oh," she added lightly, almost as an afterthought. "And do lock your door, Mrs. Hart. It would be a shame if anything happened while you were dreaming of better places." The door closed with a soft click that sounded louder than any slam. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, heart pounding. The room felt smaller. The walls, closer. The trunk at her feet began to look less like luggage and more like a box. She knew now that Mrs. Whitcomb would not let her go easily. The friendly offer of help had been a test. Eleanor had failed it by wanting to leave. There was no more time to wait for Anna's reply. No more room for cautious plans. That night, after the house settled and the lights went out one by one, Eleanor dressed in her plainest clothes, put her few coins in her pocket, and slipped her folded letter inside her coat. She did not take the trunk. It was too heavy, too loud, too obvious. She told herself she would send for it later. She opened her door a fraction. The hallway was dark, lit only by a line of light where the gas sconce at the far end had been turned down instead of off. She listened. Nothing but the steady tick of the hall clock. Barefoot, to muffle her steps, she moved toward the stairs. The house creaked around her, old bones shifting in their sleep. Halfway down, she stopped at the double-creaking step. For the first time, she looked down at it deliberately, not as a quirk of the house, but as a warning. "I am not yours," she whispered under her breath. Not sure if she was talking to the stair, the house, or the woman sleeping below. She put her weight on the outer edge of the tread, trying to avoid the worst of the sound. Even so, the familiar double creak echoed up from beneath her feet, as if the space under the staircase was protesting her escape. At the bottom of the stairs, she could see the dim outline of the front door. The latch, the deadbolt, the chain. She could be outside in seconds, on the street, in the cold air, away. She took one more step. Behind her, in the darkness of the hallway, a floorboard whispered under a new weight. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Hart?" The voice was low, almost pleasant, and much too close. When the skull rolled out from under the staircase, it came with a little puff of dust, as if the house itself had sighed in relief. For years, the boarding house on Hawthorne Street had carried its secret quietly. All it took to break the silence was a renovation order and a workman with a crowbar. It was more than a decade after Eleanor Hart vanished. By then, people in the neighborhood barely remembered her name. Rooms in boarding houses turn over quickly. One tenant leaves, another takes their place, and the only record is a line in a ledger, gathering grease in a kitchen drawer. Mrs. Whitcomb was gone, too, buried in a neat grave with a proper stone that said she had been a devoted wife and a respectable landlady. The house had passed to a distant nephew, who cared more about the rent than the history. He wanted modern stairs. The old staircase, with its worn red carpet and double creaking step, was an eyesore in his eyes. He hired a small crew to rip it out and put in something new, something straight, clean, forgettable. The workers arrived on a gray morning with toolboxes and cigarettes, made a few jokes about the age of the place, and started prying up treads that had held 100 years of footsteps. They found the void under the stairs by accident. "Careful with that one," the foreman called as a younger man wedged his crowbar under the step that had always creaked twice. The wood splintered, revealing a dark, cramped space filled with dust and stale air. "Rat nest, probably," someone muttered. Then something round and pale tumbled out and hit the floorboards with a hollow knock. For a heartbeat, nobody understood what they were looking at. Then the shape tilted, empty eye sockets catching the light. One of the men cursed and staggered back. Another dropped his crowbar. Someone yelled for the foreman. Someone else, voice suddenly very small, said, "That's a head." Work stopped. The police were called. By the time officers arrived, the skull and the first handful of bones had been placed gently in an empty coal scuttle and covered with a tarp, as if modesty still mattered. The foreman met them at the door, face pale under the dust. "We were just doing the stairs," he said. "I swear, we didn't know there was anything under there. You can smell it now, can't you? How did nobody ever smell that?" The lead detective did not answer. He could smell it. An old, sour scent that had seeped into the wood over years. The kind of smell people explain away as bad pipes, damp walls, spoiled food, anything but what it really is. The cellar under the stairs was barely tall enough for a man to stand upright. With the steps removed, it looked like a jaw missing teeth. Officers crawled inside with flashlights and gloved hands, sifting through dirt that had clearly been disturbed and packed again, long after the house was built. They found more bones, a spine, ribs, the long, narrow bones of arms and legs, scraps of fabric that might once have been a dress, a rusted metal clasp, buttons, no jewelry, no shoes. Whoever had put her there had not wasted space on unnecessary items. The news traveled fast. By late afternoon, Hawthorne Street was crowded with onlookers. Neighbors pressed against the sawhorses the police had set up, straining for a better look at the house they had walked past 1,000 times without suspecting what was inside. "I always said that place felt wrong," one woman insisted. "The way she watched everybody, Mrs. Whitcomb, I mean. God rest her soul, but she was not an easy woman." "You never complained when your brother rented a room there," someone else replied. "He paid on time?" the woman shot back. "That makes a difference, doesn't it?" An old man in a flat cap shook his head. "There was that girl," he said. "The quiet one. Widow. Worked at a hat shop. What was her name? Hart? Hart? Something? My wife used to ask about her. One day she was just gone. Mrs. W. said she ran off. Maybe she didn't." Inside the house, detectives spread out. They checked the ledger in the kitchen, its pages yellowed but still legible. Under the year Eleanor had lived there, they found her name. Mrs. E. Hart, room 3. Next to it, in neat ink, was a note. Left without forwarding address. Personal effects abandoned. The same phrase appeared next to 2 other names that year. "Convenient," one officer murmured. They visited the milliner's shop, now under new ownership. The current proprietor knew nothing, but an older former worker remembered a woman who matched Eleanor's description. "She was good with a needle," the woman said. "Quiet, but not unfriendly. Then Mrs. Langley said she'd stopped coming in. No notice. Just gone. We figured she'd found something better, or married again." She paused. Or maybe not. At the post office, they found a stack of envelopes addressed to Eleanor's sister, Anna, all marked "Return to Sender." Somewhere along the line, Anna had moved, or remarried, or died. The letters, whatever they contained, had never reached her. One of them had been mailed from Hawthorne Street a week after Eleanor's last confirmed rent payment. The handwriting on the envelope looked nothing like Eleanor's neat script. "That's not her hand," the former milliner's worker said, studying the letters when the detectives brought them by. "She made her A's like little tents, not loops, and she would never have misspelled her own name on the return address." The return address read, Eleanor Hart. Piece by piece, a picture formed. A woman who arrived alone, who owed money, who tried to leave. A landlady who controlled every aspect of her tenants' lives, including who knew when they were gone. A staircase that creaked twice because something under it was not entirely still. It was enough for the detective to request an exhumation of Mrs. Whitcomb's body. That request was denied. She had died years earlier, officially of natural causes, and the city was not eager to dig up the dead on the chance of confirming what everyone now suspected. In the official file, the victim was labeled Jane Doe, probable age 30 to 40, Caucasian, cause of death undetermined. The note continued. Likely resident of the boarding house during tenure of former owner. Evidence suggests homicide and concealment. Primary suspect deceased. Case closed, unsolved, finally acknowledged. For the people on Hawthorne Street, the story did not close so neatly. Some tenants moved out as soon as their leases allowed, suddenly uncomfortable living in a house that had been a grave. Others stayed, telling themselves that whatever had happened was in the past. The world outside was dangerous too. At least here, the walls were familiar. The new owner replaced the staircase, had the cellar floor poured over with concrete, and painted the foyer a cheerier color. He did not advertise the house's history to prospective lodgers. Why would he? It was hard enough to find reliable tenants. Yet the story seeped out anyway. Reporters wrote breathless pieces about the woman buried in the boarding house. Radio programs dramatized the discovery, adding screams and thunder that had never been there. They made Mrs. Whitcomb into a caricature, the evil landlady. They made Eleanor into something even less human, a spooky legend. In none of those stories did anyone talk much about who she had been before she became an unexplained gap in the ledger and a set of bones under the stairs. No one mentioned the letter she had tried to send, the one that never reached Anna. No one spoke about the way she had touched the quilt on the bed that first night, letting herself believe she might finally be safe. No one bothered to wonder what it felt like, realizing too late that the house you chose because it felt solid was the one place you would never escape. Years later, when true crime writers came looking for material, they found the official file, the newspaper clippings, and a few elderly neighbors willing to talk about that poor widow who disappeared. They folded those fragments into chapters with tidy endings, as if justice had been served simply because the body had been found. But if you stand on Hawthorne Street today, if you look up at that narrow brick house with its fresh paint and new steps, you can still feel the unease that made people cross to the other side of the road without quite knowing why. The building is just another rental now. Students live there, office workers, people who scroll through their phones on the same stairs where a skull once rolled. Most of them do not know the story. A few have heard a version. They joke about ghosts when the stair creaks, or a draft moves the curtains. They say things like, "This is the room where they say she stayed," and laugh, because it is easier than thinking about what it really means. The real horror of Eleanor Hart's story is not only that she died and was hidden in her own boarding house. It is that for more than 10 years, almost everyone around her accepted the simplest explanation, that a poor, widowed woman had just slipped away, unimportant enough to lose without looking too hard. The bones under the stairs forced the city to admit she had been there. They did not force anyone to care who she had been. That part, the part that turns a skull back into a person, is left to whoever hears her story now, and refuses to let the woman buried in the boarding house be the only name she has.